Just as the panellists are settling in, here we are a year on from, strangely enough, last year, last January. A year older, a year smarter, and for some firms, hopefully nobody here significantly or at all, but £494 million poorer based upon the number or the value of fines levied by the FSA, FCA in 2013. So we have an hour. I appreciate it's what's keeping us from the drink, being Father Ted fan, drink. But the session, we'll have an hour broken down into 6 segments. We'll have the objective is a fairly free-flowing discussion on each. Interaction from the panellists. I've got the pad here, so I'll chip in with some questions as and when. And if I can maybe just ask the panellists each to sort of introduce yourself, your organisation and your role within it.
Hi, good afternoon everybody. I'm Johal from Cordium.
Simon Morris, CMS Cameron McKenna.
I'm Eve Ellis, Charles Russell.
Hi, Jennifer Wood, the Alternative Investment Management Association.
Arjun Singh-Muchelle from the Investment Management Association.
Thank you very much. We've had John's questions earlier, and I'm going to intersperse those as we go through our session. These are the 6 areas we're going to discuss. This is my 25th year now working in UK compliance, and back in October 1989 when I told Dennis Casey I was resigning or transferring to this new department in Irish Life called the Compliance Department, Dennis said, infamously and genuinely did say this, there is no future in it, it won't catch on. Time travel 24 years. Dennis Casey is the Chief Executive of Irish Life and Permanent, who was found guilty, if you want to call it that, of making multi-billion-pound transfers to another financial institution and lost his job over a matter of compliance. So it does seem to have caught on from what I hear. Initial commentary from me, FCA. We've had Loutro IMRO, we've had PIA, we've had FSA, now we've got FCA. It's all getting very tiring, but also it is quite interesting. We've got the FCA, as you know, since April 2013, according to their own statistics, 26,000 firms, 23 of which they are the exclusive regulator of. Running costs about 550 million for the last year of the FSA, and the FCA for this year is 646 million. A princely sum, and quite an impressive level of fines applied, 474 million, the best year ever. Unfortunately, it doesn't go into the pot as it used to do. It goes to the British Armed Forces once they deduct their costs. So everything changes, nothing changes. We see and hear the same things, which I'm sure will come out in the panel discussions in terms of what the regulators say need to be attended to and firms need to be mindful of. There were a couple of documents that were key documents. FCA Journey to, as I keep wanting to say, the centre of the earth, but it's not. It's Journey to the FCA, October 2012, and also the business plan. So just to refresh our memories, the vision of the FCA to make relevant markets work well so consumers get a fair deal. 3 broad outcomes. Consumers get financial services and products that meet their needs from firms they can trust. Markets and financial systems are sound, stable and resilient with transparent pricing information, and firms compete effectively with the interests of their customers and the integrity of the market at the heart of how they run their business. A couple of quotes from the FCA. So from the boardroom to the point of sale and beyond, firms' behaviour must be about good conduct. And another, essentially, we'll be looking for firms to base their business model, their culture, and how they run their business on the foundation of fair treatment of customers. When I train on TCF, and well, on a number of matters, but in particular, I ask a question about TCF and how long has it been around, and generally people say, 6, 7, 8 years, and it's in there and has been in there since 1988, nestling as in the 11 principles for business, number 6. Due regards to the interests of your customers and treat them fairly, and wholesale firms can say on occasion, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us, that's to do with the retail market, and that's not the case. All the principles applied to the whole sort of regulatory regime and firms who are regulated. So How does the FCA supervise firms? You've got what was known as ARROW, now Firm Systemic Framework, event-driven work, and then fast and intensive campaigns. So looking at current priorities and what firms should look out for in 2014, if I can start the ball rolling with the results of John's question 1. We can see that on the screen. And the question was, in your opinion, has the creation of the FCA improved how alternative asset managers are regulated in the UK? No difference for 69%, yes for 22%, and it's worse for 9%. I don't know, to the panel, maybe Eve, do you have a view on the results of the poll, but what you're seeing and your firm seeing in terms of FCA interest and focus?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably reflects sort of where our clients are. I mean, we have had increasingly a number of clients looking to update policies and procedures linked to the sort of, the change in the FCA and their focus on different priorities, but I think also as a result of specific thematic reviews. And I know we're going to sort of touch on thematic reviews later, so I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but questions that clients are asking are how do they manage conduct risk and those sorts of things. And I think it's worth pointing out, and I think the first thing I'm going to mention is probably a common theme that's been mentioned throughout the day, but one key thing is record keeping. And I don't think we can sort of probably stress enough the importance of making sure that you evidence the decision process and that you keep a record of it. Because I think the FCA's view is very much, if it didn't get recorded, then it didn't happen. So it's really important that records are kept, and also that records are kept and collated in an easy way to be able to access them should you need to going forward. And related to that, I think the other key point is keeping an eye on enforcement action and making sure that you're learning the lessons and implementing those lessons in your policies and procedures. And I think it's quite easy to look at enforcement action in isolated circumstances and say, well, that's relevant to that sector, it's therefore not relevant to me. But I think one thing that probably is becoming more, the FCA are focusing on more, is making sure that people look at all enforcement cases and apply that across their business, even if it's not in their sector. So one of the recent cases I think you can sort of take lessons from, for example, which isn't in the asset management space, is the Wholesale finding, which was retail rather than wholesale. It was in insurance, not asset management. But I think there are some really interesting lessons there to be learned, and the FCA would expect those to be applied in asset management businesses. So, for example, looking at accountability, making sure that senior management are, as I said, accountable, aware of all their regulatory duties. So, I think there are a couple of...
Yeah, as it happens, I have a copy of the final notice for Wholesale here.
Yeah.
As if by magic.
As if by magic.
Yeah. Hey, the firm failed to ensure the board gave sufficient attention to compliance issue. The firm failed to ensure its senior management undertook adequate regular training. The firm had a bias within its remuneration structure for the sales team. It did not have due regard to the interests of its customer and treat them fairly. It didn't communicate with clients in a way that was... Interestingly, it says clear, fair, not misleading rather than fair, clear, but that's what it's general insurance, because for some strange reason general insurance is clear and fair rather than fair and clear. So here we are 25 years, 26 years into regulation, and the kind of things that you would have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'm sure Simon can attest to this, being a doyen of enforcement cases. Nothing new there, do you think?
I think there's nothing really new about the FCA. They're far more focused. The FSA never really grappled with alternative funds until they blew up in its hands and it didn't really know what to do and ran around and looked a bit worried. I think the FCA is more focused, and I think I agree absolutely with what we've just heard here. In the 21st century, sharpen your pencils and keep very clear records. Also, look at everything. You are supposed to look every day at the FCA website. It's like in 1984. You didn't know there's a hidden camera in the FCA website recording whether you're looking at the screen and your reaction, whether you're laughing or weeping. That's all being recorded at Canary Wharf. And you're supposed to look at read the speeches, read the enforcement cases, look on the website, even read the board minutes. There's always something in that for you. And what we're hearing, and I think the Wholesale case is a very important one. It shows how things can go badly off the rails. The difference between the FCA and the FSA is the FCA is concerned with wholesale. Your wholesale, that was really off the FSA radar. FCA, you are firmly on the radar as wholesale. You're firmly on the radar as alternate funds with very little retailization, and you're firmly on the radar for everything that matters, which could be incentivization, remuneration, responsibility of manufacturers for your distributors, responsibility for handling conflicts. So every theme, every campaign, the FCA is like a students' union. It's got to have a new campaign every month to keep you on your toes. And we can't have boycott apartheid South Africa anymore. We therefore have to have something slightly more relevant. And the campaigns such as conflict, such as remuneration, such as directed commission, are all foursquare on the FCA. So as you've just heard from my learned friend here, you've got to be glued to the website now and sharpen your pencils and keep those records.
Have we seen from a trade sort of IMA or an AIMA perspective in the last 12 months, has there been any meaningful difference in how the FCA engages with organisations such as yourselves?
Go on, after you.
I'd say FCA has been much more proactive in reaching out to trade associations to chat with us about developments, to try and engage us, to engage members in compliance issues that they're seeing. I think that's a difference that we've seen.
We've been approached a couple of times, haven't we, on AIFMD, where they've actually said, would you like to come in and talk to us about what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, which is good. It's not something I don't think we experienced in the days of the FSA, did we?
No, not at all. That's very true, and it's interesting that the approach seems to be very much more sort of on the front foot. I think there was an avowed, perhaps, if I can say so, the lack of engagement beforehand. 2012 has seen that change ever so slightly, and I think going forward that's certainly going to be the case. And it's absolutely a welcome move, I think.
If we were to use our crystal balls for the business plan because our financial year is coming to an end, the end of March, any thoughts as to what could conceivably be in the plan for next year? More of the same or accent in particular ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably more of the same. I suppose in the asset management space, things that I think are probably going to be of particular focus, I'd probably say product design and product intervention, which I think are interesting areas, particularly on the product intervention side. It's probably a newer area for the FCA and something that the FSA didn't do. The other thing I think that asset management will be a focus for is fee arrangements. And I think the FCA have already said that they're going to focus on fee arrangements in the context of asset management. They will sort of scrutinise spending, make sure it's fair, in the interests of clients. So I think that's something that, particularly this audience will probably, there will be a focus on that. And that, I suppose, looking at sort of the different sectors within asset management, I think private equity particularly may be under the spotlight in relation to sort of fees and, again, expenses, and making sure that they are fair and transparent. Although I think that's probably aligned with what investors are looking for as well. So I think they're a little bit of crystal ball gazing on my side.
I think the things that, I wouldn't say the things that go on, because, well, there are things that go on in all industries, but in taking PE as an example, if you've got a fund, you've got a manager and you have a portfolio company, and the money that transfers between them and the fees that are applied by whom in respect of what, it would, if you pick that up and put it in the retail space, it'd be ripe for review. So the question is whether they have the appetite or they see the need or desire to go on a quest in relation to that in the wholesale sector. So.
Yeah, well, insofar as, the question that was posed and whether there was any difference as far as the FCA's work is concerned, I think something to bear in mind is that the FCA has just undergone a hiring process of getting on board about 85 to 90 members of staff, and they're all going to be coming online, that's an interesting phrase, and they're all going to be starting on the 1st of March onwards. So, so the FCA has gone through an entire hiring process recently, so you can expect to hear from them more frequently as far as 2014 is concerned and moving forward. Something to bear in mind, I would say, insofar as the FCA's work this year, is that for the first time you have a regulator who's got a competition objective written into their rules, and they've just recently hired a lady whose name escapes me from the former Competition Commission to come and head up their competition unit at the FCA, and they're currently conducting a thematic review. We're going to come on to this later. On wholesale markets and on wholesale conduct. both from a conduct point of view, but also whether there's sufficient competition within wholesale markets. So that's something to look forward to next year. And very quickly, if I can, on a particular piece of legislation where there's been a bit of work today. I was at a different conference actually earlier today, where Verena Ross from ESMA was speaking, and on MiFID in particular. And something to bear in mind as far as MiFID is concerned is that I'm sure all of you know what MiFID is, but for those of you who don't, it's going to change the way the city operates, particularly in the market space. So, for example, if you've got a broker who routes your trades through their BCNs, for example, BCNs are no longer going to be allowed under MiFID. So your broker will need to re-register either as an SI or an MTF. If your broker uses, for example, their own prop cap to facilitate your trade, it's now going to need to go. They're now going to need to re-register as a systematic internalizer. What that means for asset managers or alternative asset managers is, well, post-trade, what sort of transparency are we going to have? Are we going to know whether my broker, for example, not to pick on Goldman Sachs, for example, Goldman Sachs routed my trade through Sigma X, and if they have, how much money have they made off my trade as my broker, in addition to the broker fees I'm paying them? So there are various concerns
when
in
is
MiFID.
this? When is this going to?
And so far as timeline, I mean,
isn't it?
the rules are currently being discussed. ESMA is going to be coming out with their discussion paper and consultation documents in May of this year. So any of you, looking to respond to any of this work, May is when this entire process starts. It takes about 12 months to 18 months for them to get the rules right, and then you're looking for implementation, or what they call date of application, the 1st of January 2017. But now's the time to try and influence what they do.
Once we get AIFMD, we could call it MiFID 2, we're going to need a bigger boat or something along those lines. So yes, everything changes, nothing changes, so here's the next thing chugging along the tracks. On the area of thematic reviews, do you consider the thematic and enforcement policies, credible deterrents the FCA pursues, are relevant to the alternative asset management sector? And the answer is 71% yes. I had a look in the last few days as to the number of thematic reviews they'd carried out and the topics, and there was some in there that I wasn't even aware that they'd done. Favourites such as the motor legal expenses insurance thematic review that kicked off 2013, TR 13.1, and also the automatic renewal of fixed term bonds thematic review. So coming to a cinema near you. So there are some, I know the ones that we are of interest to us are the ones that, strange enough, are of interest to us. So the ones that we see are things like conflicts of interest, outsourcing, and transition management. So on the area of thematic reviews and attestations, in the good old days, IMRO, and around that time, 2001, so more than 12 years ago, you get them descending on your doorstep and you've got 3 people for 3-4 weeks. Now the theme is whatever they choose, but something relevant, hopefully, and you've got 2 people for 2 hours. We had 2 of our clients had a visit on consecutive days last week, whereas in my 3.5 years with Cordium, actually having more than 10, there were less than 10 in 3.5 years, and we had 2 in as I say, 2 days. Thematic reviews, to me, make an awful lot of sense. It makes economic sense in terms of just you're not putting people into a firm to look at things for the sake of looking at them. You can be focused, and you can get a very good idea, as we do when we go into firms, within an hour or so, the language, the attitude, the organisation. When you pick up a compliance manual and it's got 2007 on it, you've got a fairly good idea things have gone a little stale. So we've had AML, anti-bribery and corruption, outsourcing, dealing commissioners, thematic reviews. We've got an annual attestation from the 1st of January in relation to non-mainstream pooled investments, which we'll touch on when we get to marketing. You had the well-known conflicts of interest paper in November 2012, which had, for the first time, an attestation that was required, bizarrely, if you got it through the post. So the vagaries of the Royal Mail determined whether you knew you were on the hook for this attestation. 160 firms went out to the industry, and as we said earlier, if it's a fine, if it's a speech, it applies to you to the degree that it is relevant. So if it's talking about training, you need to consider, is training an issue for us? Is this something we need to consider? So the attestation, our advice was treat it as if you had got it yourself, in so much that you made the attestation to your own board that you were satisfied your conflicts arrangements were sufficiently robust. In my view, attestations are the future, and we saw the future with the unloved child of the FSA, which was the Gabriel system. But most people do acknowledge it's useful because at least Gabriel tells you what you need to do and when you need to do it. That was modified to introduce NGPs, non-Gabriel papers, controllers and close links, and now with the FCA it has been used for reporting, REP 001 or REP 002. So there's absolutely no reason why we can't have an REP 49, 72 and 112. It's just down to the FCA to decide what it wants the attestation on. So I've got a question, if I can poll a question for you to consider. The appliance of science. Since the 1st of April last year, this is sort of to update my statistics if nothing else, has your firm received either or been subject to a thematic review or visit or had a material interaction from the FCA, not with it? What I mean by that is, you submit your Gabriel return, somebody rings you up and queries a data entry. I don't see that as a material interaction. It might be, on a number of our clients it happens, so they ring up and they want to talk to somebody about, it's a PE firm, and they want to talk about how valuations are arrived at or determined. So if the audience could vote on whether you've had a material interaction or a thematic review. So that's 6.8. The statistic I usually do in my 3.5 years, I'm aware of about 8. And with our 2 last week, 10. So we've got 10% of 71 respondents. So a lot of firms, it is business as usual in that you fill out your returns, you're a good citizen, you don't really want to do a Principle 11 notification if something goes wrong because you're terrified if you do, they'll come through the windows on ropes. But you really are on the back foot if they ever come in and ask you the question, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you do the Principle 11 and tell us everything we reasonably should be made aware of? Because if they're asking you that question, they would most likely reasonably believe that you should have told them. Then it looks like you're either incompetent because you didn't know you had to tell them or didn't think about it, or you're being willful and withholding information for not doing it. So you're not particularly in a good place either way. So, Eve, another question of you. Your experience or your firm's experience relative to clients, their areas of interest on thematics, is there anything that you're seeing as a theme or trend?
I suppose not necessarily a theme or a trend, but certainly clients are paying attention to thematic reviews, and whether it's just generally sort of the regulatory environment changing or specific sort of thematic reviews. But for example, there's been a lot more interest in AML procedures and policies, and clients asking us to update those policies for them. And I think that's a real area of interest for the FCA. And I think not only do you need to have your policy in place, but you then need to follow your policy, and the policy needs to obviously comply with the law. But I think what's critical, particularly with AML, is that it's actually user-friendly and appropriate for your firm. Because if you don't follow your policy, then that's where the FCA are going to come after you. And when you've seen a number of the cases, and actually this was highlighted very recently, Standard Bank received a fine. And again, that wasn't because they had failings in relation to money laundering, but because they didn't follow their policies. So the first things that firms need to ensure is that their policy works, because if it doesn't work, then it's going to be very difficult for people to follow internally. And I think that's where you're going to have problems if the FCA come looking. And the Standard Bank case was interesting in a number of respects, because it was the first case actually the FCA I think had brought in relation to commercial banking. And again, comes back to what I mentioned earlier about not necessarily being sector-specific for asset management, but emphasises the fact that it's important to look at cases outside the sector, but again really reinforce the fact that if you're not following your procedures, and in that case there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that there were a lot of customers connected with politically exposed persons and they weren't following the risk assessment and the procedures properly there, and also not sort of doing ongoing monitoring and keeping client information up to date. So I think that, and that's something that clients are asking us to sort of help them sort of test their policies to make sure that they work in practice, so that they are very much fit for purpose for their firm.
Is there something, Simon, from Cameron, McKenna perspective, your experience, where one or two things off the top of your head are the things, if you get this right, you're in a good place, or what people tend to trip up on?
Yeah. When you sign an attestation, and I assume some people among that 6 or 7% who replied will have signed an attestation, please get it right. Please, A, get it right, and please make sure, B, you have an audit trail to support it. Because the FCA says that they are entirely dependent and reliant upon you to give them the accurate information upon which you rely. And so I'm aware of 2 instances where the FCA has determined, ascertained, the affirmation was wrong. In one case, the firm dashed off an affirmation by return saying, yes, our client money is fine. Of course, needless to say, the client money wasn't fine, it was a complete mess. So when the firm proceeded against the firm for breach of when FCA proceeded against the firm for breach of client money, they also added in a Principle 11 charge, failing to be open and cooperative with the regulator. The chief executive, fortunately, was skiing the day it was signed. It was signed by somebody who no longer had a career at the firm, let us say. The only reason personal action wasn't taken against the chief exec was that he didn't actually sign the letter. He was skiing out of the jurisdiction. May I recommend that? I have another case where the FCA was, until last week, it has mysteriously dropped the case, taking individual action against the chief exec of a very prominent house for signing an affirmation confirming that certain controls were in place when they weren't. Now, he signed the affirmation in absolute good faith because the chief administrative officer, let us say, had told him it was correct. And the chief administrative officer knew it wasn't quite correct, but knew that he'd have his head bitten off if he said it wasn't correct. And therefore, the person who gave the information to the chief administrative officer, who actually said this is wrong, there was a lot of heads rolling here. Now, astonishingly, the FCA has decided they didn't have sufficient grounds to proceed against the chief exec. But can I assure you, it is not very nice for a period of 22 months to have this kind of charge hanging over you. So unless you would like to become a very good client of Eve or myself, and don't let me stop you, if you're ever asked to sign an affirmation, do not sign it unless you have got a fat audit trail and Eve or I have signed it off for you, please.
Inspect what you expect, and if you're signing it, you have a sound and good basis. And that's why I think Gabriel and attestations are the future, because it's no additional, apart from some programmers, no additional burden of effort on the part of the FCA. And if they have a little program and it says if you answer no and no is bad, then they just follow up. From a IMA or an AIMA perspective, we recently had the Dealing Commission last year. Actually, we had Fiona Bissett from the FCA, who politely declined to be here this year. She was here, and the topic came up because I think it had come up at a UBS conference just before Christmas. So this has been of much discussion and debate over the last 12 months. FCA engagement on that sort of theme. I know we had the consultation paper. Do we think it was positive from your perspective? Take your pick as to.
It was interesting. The IMA, we've issued a 36-page report / response to the Use of Dealing Commission FCA paper. And during the research for our response, we found that there were concerns that we had with the way dealing commissions were currently being used, where we saw data as to how, as to the level of cost that managers pay for research, So, for example, we saw that the larger houses, thinking about the BlackRocks of the world, pay between 1 to 4 bips for full service brokerage, whereas small to medium houses pay between 14 to 16 bips for full service brokerage. Now, we considered that a problem insofar as that may lead to a tiering of brokerage services, where you would have the big houses who will continue to get voice high touch services, including research, corporate access, continue that and continue to be charged between 1 to 4 bips. Whereas you'd have a second tier of service for small to mid-cap firms who would get a low-touch automated service, which would be execution only. So we're not talking about corporate access or research for small to mid-cap firms. And so we did see that coming out naturally insofar as the current Research and Dealing Commission market is concerned. So we said, well, hold on a second, there's already a problem here. We didn't consider it to be market failure yet, but it's certainly getting to that point. So we came up with 8 principles, which took a heck of a lot of time to get members around the table and our board to agree, and put those out. And we've called on IOSCO to come up with international rules and cross-border rules on the use of dealing commission and research and and paying for corporate access and so on. So we now wait for the FCA to respond. This is being addressed in MiFID as well. I was with the FCA yesterday, where under MiFID, only minor non-monetary benefits, or what their definition of minor non-monetary benefit is allowed as payable under the new inducements rules or commission rules. And so, of course, I asked the question, well, does the FCA consider research to be a minor non-monetary benefit? And they sort of waffled and didn't really answer the question. But just something to bear in mind, the research market in the UK alone, we're looking at upwards of almost £2 billion a year. Now, whether you consider £2 billion a year minor non-monetary, I would say, well,
yeah, it's a fair sum of money.
It is not something to scoff at.
Okay. A couple of questions. Does the panel expect the FCA's responsibility for consumer credit from April to take some of the focus away from asset managers? I don't know if any of you guys have a view on that. I know it's an additional responsibility. I haven't heard the recruiting for it, so conceivably, but it's not as if it was a surprise they were taking responsibility for it. Anybody have a view either way?
No, other than the fact that it's going to sort of spread existing resource potentially more thinly unless they recruit.
A good point, and this was particularly relevant back in, is it A-Day, N-Day? I forgot which day it was, but it was back in 2001 when consultation papers were coming out at the rate of knots, 2-3 a week, because they were obliged to consult. The question is, many FCA consultative papers are so long and complicated, can we really expect smaller hedge funds or alternative managers to be able to engage in a consultative process? Does the panel think industry can effectively influence regulation? I think that must be you guys down the end. Jennifer, do you have a...
Well, speaking for a trade body, I suppose I would say to that collective action at trade body level is usually really important, and usually, and especially given the FCA's current openness to discussion with industry trade bodies and their openness to interacting with us at all stages of consultation, and sometimes even before they actually get ready to consult. I'd say, feeding into that process through whatever trade association you prefer is a very good idea.
Because my view on consultative papers, you could look at it 2 extreme ways. One is it's a done deal, they've made up their mind because what's in the CP ends up becoming reality. But you could equally say, well, they engage in the first place, and therefore what they put in the CP is considered and thought through, and they don't always slavishly follow what they put in the CP. So do we think that they do generally engage?
I think we might grow to miss them.
CPs?
Which is controversial.
Stimulate discussion.
Just for example, if you look at EMIR and the implementation around that, of course it's a regulation, so it's directly applicable, and therefore there was no consultation, which possibly was one of the reasons why. There's a myriad of other reasons as well, of course, but the lack of a consultation process, there was perhaps a lack of engagement with the directive, and of course we'll see that repeatedly with the F&D level 2. Of course, these things are all directly applicable, and the consultation process and the policy statements, etc., really important in the way in which industry affects regulation, the way in which industry engages with it, understands it implicitly, intrinsically. So I think actually peculiarly we may actually gross a miss a little bit.
Well, hold on a second. As a former regulator, I think we're being a little too hard on the FCA. There's, insofar as EMIR is concerned, it is a regulation and therefore directly applicable European law. But there was a consultation on EMIR, both by the European Commission and separately by the European Parliament. In addition, ESMA at level 2 came out with a whole plethora of consultation papers and discussion papers. There certainly wasn't FCA-led. That's because the FCA is part of ESMA, and so therefore the FCA had a role in writing those consultation papers and discussion papers published by ESMA. So I think we're being a little too hard on the FCA. So of course responding to consultation papers is extremely important.
Hard in what way?
To say that consultation papers are getting too complicated, and therefore, can we expect smaller
But if you're a 3-4,
the answer is yes, of course. Consultations are getting more complicated and they are getting more specialised. But I don't see that as a reason to not respond. If anything, I would see that as a reason to respond, to try and ensure that the regulator fully understands the nuances of small and mid-sized firms, which which may sometimes get lost. And as Jennifer said, engaging with your trade bodies is exceedingly important, and providing data and evidence to your associations or to the FCA or ESMA is exceedingly important. Anything that will help create evidence-based policy making is vital.
Okay, thank you. Which brings us on to, or we touched on it, EMIR, that nice Irish girl, or EMIR, European Markets Infrastructure Regulation. Obligations came into effect from the 12th of February, and from that date, all counterparties need to report details of derivative contracts, OTC and exchange traded, they've concluded. This is something we could probably have maybe next year. It could be the theme. Whatever else has come along. So I know we're experiencing it with our clients, lots of questions. What does it mean? What do I have to do? I'm not doing anything. Should I be doing something? Will they come through the window on ropes? That constant question. Bobby, do you have a sense of being our technical guru within Cordium, a sense of the traffic or the top sort of questions or queries or concerns you're hearing?
Yeah, so it's as you've already mentioned, it's an extremely complicated directive, and of course there has been consultation at European level, but perhaps the lack of local consultation perhaps led to a little bit of a lack of engagement, or at least as much as they could have been and possibly should have been. So for whatever reason, perhaps the implementation's been somewhat unsteady. Lots of issues outstanding. I don't propose to go into the requirements of the directive in full. Of course, that we could be here. I was.
There's always later when we've had a few.
Yes, afterwards. So it's mentioned already. It's directly applicable. Just the sheer volume of change, also, maybe somewhat, at least for this sector, overshadowed by the AFMD. Everyone was sort of perhaps gazed as averted, sort of dealing with the implementation of that. The speediness with which some of the rules came into play. So, for example, the trade reporting obligations came into play sort of 80 days after the first TR was authorised. So that led to a few issues in terms of implementation. So there's a few outstanding issues which need to be addressed. But from the FCA's point of view, and for the purposes of this panel discussion, it's interesting to see how the FCA addressed the change. So the intention was, of course, to their own stated intention, that is, I should say, was to review an implementation, have an implementation review in the course of 2013. A few things were delayed, but in either event, they did actually have a thematic review towards the end of the year. Actually, I think the first one started in July of last year in one respect, and right the way through to January was the last one. And they issued a number of fact sheets on their findings in terms of industry readiness for that.
All on the website,
all on the website, all on the FCA EMIR website, which is actually very helpful.
Okay.
Indeed. And in terms of, so one of the interesting ones, of course, and one that's just come into play was in respect of reporting and some of the issues they found. In respect of reporting, I can just summarise them very quickly, is that most firms, of course, at this stage, one would have hoped this is the case, would have decided whether they themselves would be reporting or using a delegated reporting service. But for some smaller firms especially, some of their service providers, some counterparties hadn't decided on a solution for themselves. So the smaller firms are sort of left with the sort of forced into sort of having to negotiate terms with the TR and do all the kind of onboarding and etc. And then that led to sort of IT and communication issues and some infrastructure issues and concerns. And that's cost implications and etc. So that was a bit of an issue that the FCA identified in one of their fact sheets. There's an issue about backloading, of course, which may or may not be applicable for some firms. The issue of having to report trades that are outstanding at a given date, not relevant for managers who intend to be AIFMs, which was a good result, but nevertheless that's an issue. But a lot of the issues do relate to sort of IT issues in respect of, well, the UTI generation is a big issue.
UTI
The unique trade identifier. Every single trade has to have a unique identifier in the universe. It has to be a single identifier. And there's issues around the generation of that. It's been varying different ways in which one can do. There is an ISDA protocol that helps with the generation of these things, but there's a little bit of a twist the other week when ESMA issued some guidance on the generation of UTIs, which I think differed ever so slightly from the ISDA protocol that had been established, which of course now has already been built into people's IT taxonomy, so that caused a bit of an issue. There's been delays around the legal entity identifier, I should say, around the issuance of that. There's been delays there, and just in fact onboarding with the TRs, there's been issues with one or two in particular, just because of the sheer volume of traffic. The onboarding process has been delayed somewhat. So there's lots of issues around that.
What I had heard, and I don't know if anybody wants to disagree, the FCA clearly have an interest in this. It's an obligation that a firm has, and it can't. Aldous Huxley said once that facts do not cease to exist just because we choose to ignore them. So equally, that could apply to rules. But as long as a firm is, making meaningful steps, meaningful will probably be judged after the event, but meaningful steps in order to understand its obligations and meet its obligations.
Absolutely, yeah. Indeed, there was a statement on the website just the other day on the FCA website stating that they are aware that there are issues in the implementation of the directive, but as long as the firms make best efforts, and I think that was the quote, as long as they make best efforts to come into compliance, the FCA will exercise a degree of forbearance, and in either event they expect compliance by April, which is already a date in advance of when the obligations begin. It may well have been April Fool's Day, but just in advance of when technically the obligations went live. So there is the regulator is exercising a degree of forbearance. It is in the industry. It is out there, sort of seeing how firms are implementing the directive. And indeed, actually, some of our firms, no names, but have already notified the FCA that they're having certain issues with adhering to the requirements as they stand, and under Principle 11, and notified them. The idea is that we're making best efforts rather, but there are certain elements of the directive with which we will be late compliant.
Yeah, I think a principle. I'm not suggesting everybody rushes out quickly does a Principle 11 notification to the firm contact centre, but I think knowing, understanding what your obligations are, knowing what steps need to take place, having a time scale for that is clearly important, rather than you get asked the question, what are you doing about it, and you're staring into space. Yeah, not quite sure.
Absolutely. And then there's also, just finally, just in closing on this, there's been a few issues around on the scope of the requirements, particularly in the definition of what a derivative is. Pretty core issue. This goes back to the original MiFID implementation and the differing ways in which the definition of a derivative was embedded in local law. So there's a bit of a disparity. For the UK, for example, it's actually it's 7 days, or T+5. If you settle an FX forwards within that time, the FCA would consider that not to be a derivative, where in other jurisdictions, anything that's settled after T+2 is a derivative in terms of FX. So there's lots of issues around harmonisation around that. There's a letter issued by ESMA to the Commission just the other week requesting clarification on that particular point. So there's other issues around the scopes. There's a few fairly material issues outstanding still. Yes, absolutely. So it's a challenging one indeed.
And the IMA, Arjun, is it something that you've been engaged or involved with?
Yes, no, well, on EMIR, not myself personally, but my colleague David Broadway, who leads on post-trade issues for us. He's been working on this. What Verena Ross from ESMA said earlier today, insofar as the treatment of FX swaps and futures are concerned, she said that they have written to the Commission to ask for clarity in this space. Up until that point, if there's no consistency, there'll be no reporting requirement for FX swaps and futures. So until the Commission comes out with something new in this space, it's pretty much BAU.
Okay, I've got a few questions, but what I'll do is I'll just proceed with marketing, supervision and enforcement, and then I think we should have time for the questions. Marketing. So to me, marketing falls into two distinct pieces or elements. You've got the lovely COBS 412 that we know and love, or the 8 circumstances, which are now 13, under the non-mainstream pooled investments. Then you've got AIFMD and the marketing element to that. So that's one thing. And the second is the good old chestnut of fair, clear, and not misleading, which terrifies people because it's not prescriptive and you have to use your judgment. So, Bobby, any comments on or observations on the non-mainstream pooled investments? Because a lot of our clients have said to me, or firms I've spoken to, oh, it's nothing to do with me. It's to do with retail, and I don't do retail. My view with clients is everybody's retail unless you've got a very good reason to not believe they are. So if they're professional, but that's the category you put them under, category 7, then you should have a basis for that, rather than, well, of course he's not. It's not retail, but he's a person, so he might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to echo what was said earlier on about documentation and evidence, it's extremely important. And this is an area where the rules have been simply reaffirmed already or enhanced, depending on your view. But I think the rules haven't materially changed in this respect. But there was just perhaps a laissez-faire sort of interpretation or application of them. So the FCA took it upon themselves just to reiterate very clearly that the kind of complex products in their mind, non-mainstream pooled investments that we're talking about, should not be promoted to retail investors. So it's just a bit of tidying up of the existing rules. So that where we had, I think it was 8 categories under 412, there are now 13. A couple of the ones have been removed, but ostensibly, and certainly for most people in this audience, who will be dealing mostly with institutionals and per se professional investors, the rules in that sense have not changed. But this was just a way of enhancing rules that had been, I think, slackly applied, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it comes down to one of these things where you can't be satisfied that something's the case because you don't have a documented process, an established process, or if you do, you're not following it. And that, to me, the basis was, and this almost ties in with anti-bribery and corruption. You're not allowed to make facilitation payments, and if you do, they'll say, well, if you never made that payment, that bribe wouldn't have happened. Their issue would be, you didn't categorize the people to whom you were marketing, so how can you know that they're all legitimate or kosher in terms of COBS 412? Have you, I don't know, Eve, if from your experience, is that something that you've had some experience of clients querying or having queries on?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just sort of taking a step back on the whole marketing side, particularly sort of for the audience here, I mean, it's a difficult place to be when you sort of look at the new rules on sort of non-mainstream pooled investments, but also AIFMD, and sort of particularly clients that aren't EU clients. You've got, US fund managers trying to sort of navigate their way through the different rules across Europe. There is no harmonised approach at the moment, and hopefully over time things will become a little clearer. But certainly, I was getting advice from different countries at the back end of last year for a sub-threshold US fund manager. And for example, in France, the position is, it's just so unclear at the moment. And the advice from the lawyers is, it's so difficult to give advice because the position is so very difficult and it's not clear from their regulator. In Germany, for example, it's clear, but it's difficult. And if you're a sub-threshold manager, you're still going to have to register and be authorised by the German regulator. So there certainly isn't one harmonised approach. And I think that's particularly difficult for the non-EU managers. One thing that's probably worth mentioning now, actually, because actually may provide a better way through, not for the non-EU but for the EU managers, is potentially looking at the EU VECA regulations, the EU venture capital regulations, which came into force at the same time as AIFMD, and are directly applicable across the EU. And they also contain a marketing passport if you're an EU fund manager and you're managing a venture fund. And they've got the professional client category, which is the same one that's in AFMD, the same MiFID category that we're all familiar with. There's also another category that you can market to people that invest a certain amount, and they basically sort of confirm that they're comfortable with the risk. So, if you are in that sort of sub-threshold AFMD space and you're investing in ventures, sort of private equity venture capital funds, there's potentially a sort of a clearer way through on the marketing side, which may be helpful. And one thing I may, again, just before I sort of stop on the marketing, but with the, whilst again it's not relevant to our audience directly in terms of RDR and the retail aspects of non-mainstream pooled investments, for those, one of the things I've found recently is clients who used to access the market via IFAs are struggling a little bit now, because actually IFAs are so much more concerned because of RDR and because of the changes to COBS 412, that actually that's causing an issue for those managers who may have accessed the market through the IFA network. So again, sort of where RDR not directly relevant, but is potentially having an impact
I think
for clients.
We maintain an enforcement log that we share with clients. And I think it was principally IFAs mis-selling unregulated collectives that caused the change in the first place. Because for a lot of our clients, it's a lot clearer now, because they earn over £100,000 a year, they have more than 250. It's clear rather than a subjective analysis. And when fair, clear, not misleading goes horribly wrong, Simon?
Make sure it doesn't go wrong. We always use the grandmother test. Do not self-certify fair, clear, and not misleading. I've come across too many cases where you or your compliance officer or your head of legal have said it's obviously clear, fair, and not misleading. It isn't. It's horrendous. Because what you've done is you've mechanically ticked, and you haven't actually thought, how will people understand this? If you are a large institution, you'll sometimes have a consumer panel, actual customers. If you don't have any customers, well, you ought to have customers, but if you don't have any customers you want to approach, you get someone like Ipsos Mori to create a panel for you, and you actually show your marketing material to them, and they will find suitable people. So if you sell to the stinking rich, they will produce a panel of stinking rich people. If you only sell to recently politically exposed Ukrainian refugees, I gather there's a surfeit of them on the market, so you can probably poll them. But seriously, do a poll, and once you can show, you have shown a panel, and the panel has been tested and understands it, you've got a pretty robust defence to when our friends from Canary Wharf say it isn't. And if you're not large enough for that, show it around, show it to your proverbial grandmother, and if she understands it, it's fine. And if it goes wrong, I'm sorry, life is miserable. Most enforcement cases never get reported. It's only the absolute stinkers that get reported. There is a lot of FCA intervening at the moment, looking in particular at asset management promotional material for retail, principally for retail use, and saying, we want you to write to your customers to correct it. We want you to withdraw that product. The most egregious, I love that word, it is their favourite word as well, the most egregious cases go to enforcement. And if you look very carefully at the FCA website, you will occasionally see the FCA trumpeting the fact that it has caused a firm to communicate to its investors, its customers, its borrowers, to correct a point. So if you have to correct a financial promotion and contact people, the FCA will now require you to agree that they can put it on their website so they can trumpet it as one of their great achievements. So my best advice is don't get it wrong in the first place.
The poster child, I think, for fair, clear, not misleading is probably Standard Life. 2.45 was the fine, £2.45 million for a cash fund that went down. Compensation was 103 million. So it can just be the tip of the iceberg, the fine, because back in the day in Loutra, I know that when I was there, enforcement actions were probably 10% of what we dealt with. The rest were all people having their legs smacked and being told off. But it wasn't about, which was sort of different to the EMIR approach, it wasn't about beating your chest and saying, look what a good regulator we are, we're finding it to people. It was about getting the firm to put it right. And rather than sitting here and putting you through 2 years of enforcement, we'll spend that time and money by just fixing the problem in the first place. So supervision. So we had the FCA papers. We've gone through no more arrow visits, hooray, but we've now got something else. We've got the C's and the P's, so all of you should have been written to where you're a regulated entity advising as to whether you're a C1 to 4, whether you're a P1 to 4, where you're FCA dual regulated, i.e. it's doing prudential and conduct. If you're a P4, you probably need to leave because you're in financial difficulty, but clients will have tended to be, a lot of our clients, C4, P3. I know a client who manages 18 billion and it is a C4. I know a client who is an advisor and arranger, doesn't even manage money, and it's a C3. So I don't quite know what the logic is. I'm sure it'll be honed over time. But one client where they were taking on a 1.8 billion managed account, I said that's a Principle 11 notification. And the reason is I thought that might influence the categorization. When I asked the FCA when I met them with John 6 months ago, they said we'd be delighted if people told us things like that. It wouldn't probably change the, that was what I was actually told, it wouldn't change the categorization. But it is important to engage. When I was in-house, I like to write to them at least every 3 months, telling them something without becoming a nuisance, but just keeping them informed of what's happening in our business. In particular, if your business plan, when you applied, or your AIFM, if you're going through that process, if that materially changes in terms of what you do, I would tell the FCA, because you're telling them things they may reasonably want to know, because they'll come along after the event and say, oh, if only you told us you were now doing that, we would have done this, which they probably wouldn't have, but it's important to keep them in the loop. So we have the ratings, we have the thematic reviews. Engagement, I think we're generally agreed, is that right, Jennifer? Engagement with the FCA is good. It is better than perhaps it was under the FSA.
It is good, and it is actually, I can give an example of how it's good. We've recently been engaging with them over the question of the definition of funds under management for AIFMD purposes, and that definition was requiring managers to gross up their derivatives for purposes of determining how much funds under how much own funds they needed to keep. And we produced evidence, as was suggested, that that was creating difficulty for people and that it wasn't required by the directive itself, and have convinced FCA to take a look at changing their position, which resulted then in them posting a notice that they were going to look at modifications by consent in the near term and a change to the rule going forward. So I would say engaging in that way is helpful to managers.
Yeah, that's great. A few questions, but I know I've got a little bit of a buffer because we have the graveyard slot, so we've got 10 more minutes maybe. But on enforcement, so not something anybody wants to be subject to. It takes you away from your day job in terms of doing what you want to do, in terms of making money and managing investments. The two principal reasons, I said this last year, I say it every time I train, particularly on senior management obligations, the two principal reasons why firms end up in enforcement, I don't know, Simon may have a view on this, but they said it a couple of years ago at their annual conference, are lack of governance and lack of oversight. You get, from my experience, you get a regular formal board meeting, partner meeting with an agenda, relevant information is discussed, you inspect what you expect to be happening, so you have a basis upon which you think everything is okay, and in particular if you've got your attestations. Highlights of last year, the 474 million, so a record number of fines, but the lowest was 10,000 and the highest was 137.5 million. So there were some big contributors there. There were 46 events detailed on the FCA website in terms of fines. Lack of governance, lack of oversight. Anything else, Simon, in terms of top tips for keeping you out of enforcement?
I actually disagree. There's only one thing that takes you into enforcement. It's stupidity.
Right.
Stupidity comes in many shapes or forms. I think a firm can avoid enforcement, assuming you're not crooks. If anyone here is actually running a Ponzi scheme, I cannot help you. But assuming you are running a bona fide, properly constituted business, what in my experience takes you into enforcement is a lack of the intellectual curiosity to walk through the business from nose to tail, spot the risks, and make sure they're managed. I can think of any enforcement case that is the one, leaving aside the crooks, the egregious ones, I'm assuming we do not have key data represented here. If you want to falsify investments to get other people to invest in, I can't help you. I assume we do not have arch crew or their cousins represented here. If you want to take people's money and put it into all sorts of conflicted investments, no one can help you. But if you're running a decent business, spot the risks from nose to tail. What are the risks in the fundraising? What are the risks in the customer take-on? What are the risks in the suitability? What are the risks in running the mandate? What are the risks in the valuation? What are the risks in the protect you against market abuse and financial crime? What are the risks in the redemption? What are the risks in your administration? If you map the risks and refresh the maps, your mapping, you should be okay. If in the rest of the day, because that'll take from about breakfast time to mid-morning, up to lunchtime, look at the FCA website to follow the latest trends, and you'll get all these messages that everyone's talking about. I think to follow up on them is important. And in the afternoon, because you'll have completed it by lunchtime, after your siesta, your afternoon snooze, then look at your personal responsibility. Because if you're individually approved by the FCA in significant influence function, which for a lot of people here will be CF4 partner, CF1 director, you have made the promises in APA 5 to 7, which boil down to, well, I just said, I promise I have walked the business from nose to tail and spotted the risks. And FCA loves to bring cases against individuals, because if JP Morgan is fined another £137 million, we blink and turn the page. But if we actually read about someone we know being individually fined and barred and banned and whatever, we pay attention. And the FCA is giving an absolute priority to taking action against individuals. And they would love to take an action against any of you, because you have flesh and blood. And a fine of flesh and blood makes people sit up and pay attention. So this is the stupidity. If you have failed to walk through your business from nose to tail, spot the risks, alert to the trends, and make sure they're managed, well, you've got Eve's phone number and you've got my email. And we're here to help you.
One thing that I think in a lot of firms we will go into, and you start small, you grow, you get bigger, you make lots of money, you take over the world, is you've got 4 or 5 people in the room, 6 people, 10 people, you make decisions, executive decisions on a day-to-day, week-to-week, hour-to-hour basis, but it's somebody committing that decision and the rationale and the logic as to why you made decisions. And I'm always reminded of what I was told when I was in school when you're doing your maths exams, which is you plot out your thoughts, your calculations, and although you may get the wrong answer, the fact that the examiner can see how you were thinking or what you were thinking, you get some points for it. It's not just you made the wrong decision. And I think perhaps it's a similar thing with decision making within firms. You document the key decisions that you make and the rationale for them, and if they turn out to be wrong, they turn out to be wrong, but your logic and rationale will be there, and that's a lot better than a vacuum, space devoid of matter, nothing at all. A couple of questions, wide-ranging. With more directly binding EU regulation, such as CRD4, will the FCA become less or increasingly less relevant? Do we have a view?
No, not at all. The HMT sits. HMT is represented at the European Council, and HMT is the lobbying arm of the UK government in Brussels. You have members of European Parliament engaging on issues now. At the European Commission, you have FCA secondees sitting at DG Markt working on policies. You have FCA secondees across Europe in the countries that hold the rotating presidencies of the European Council. The FCA and HMT send secondees to those countries to make sure that to provide them with support and assistance whenever needed. Plus, the FCA is seen as a repository of technical knowledge for HMT negotiators at the European Council. So HMT goes out to negotiate political issues regarding financial services, but relies on the FCA for technical expertise and background. Plus, the FCA sits at ESMA, and ESMA creates and writes level 2 rules and binding technical standards and delegated acts, and the FCA has a table, has a seat at the ESMA table. So, so the FCA is going to become even more important.
It's not the FCA just running around checking the small print in fund facts.
Certainly not. Certainly not. The FCA is helping to shape policy.
Yeah, the answer to that is AIFMD. The FCA is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The FCA is actually a distributor now. If you go back to the beginning of regulation, 98, the regulators could make any rule they liked within the UK statutory framework. 1992 Investment Services Directive, they couldn't. 2007 MiFID, they couldn't even, they could do it even less. Now we're in the position that the FCA cannot formulate any policy, nor can the PRA. Very little area, very few areas are left to national discretion. They're in effect distributors of European legislation. This is not a UKIP point, I hasten to add. Look at AIFMD. Absolute failure on the part of the then FSA to engage. Read the FSA annual reports, 2002, 3, 4. Year upon year they said, oh dear, wringing their hands. We really must engage more in Brussels to try to influence them. Now, maybe, as we're hearing just now, there is actual engagement. And the UK is an important market within Europe. We're universally loved by all the other national governments in Europe, as you appreciate. But we are only one voice among over 24. We are not the exclusive voice. We are a pleader at the negotiating table. The FCA and PRA are like the milkman. They are delivering Brussels milk to your doorstep.
Last year we had the competition, didn't we, as to what AIFMD stood for. And the winner was Anglo-Saxon International Finance Must Die. So there you go. I don't know whether anybody could answer this question. What does the US Jobs Act, or how does it interact or conflict with AIFMD and general FCA rules? Quite specialist. I don't know whether... No? Okay.
No, thank you.
Right. One more question has come in. Regarding EMIR, do you recommend that small firms enlist the help of a service provider, or is it feasible and cost-effective to self-report?
Yes. Engage, yes, both
Service
of those things.
provider.
Yeah, no, engage a service provider if possible. There is, as I mentioned, a lot of very useful solutions out there. Not as they're affiliated to anything, but Bloomberg has a very good system that a lot of our clients are using. But do seek specialist help and advice. I think it's a very good idea.
Okay. Well, at that, a few minutes over, but under the 6 o'clock. Thank you very much to the panel for your contribution. I'll pass over to John. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Philip, and thank you to the panel for very informative comments there. We are just 3 minutes to 6, so my 30 minutes closing speech now has probably got to be scrubbed, and we'll just go through some just brief closing remarks. I think one of the things I noticed today, the iPad's been really great in terms of the interaction. I'd like you to participate in one final form of interaction, which is in terms of the feedback questionnaire, which I think is embedded somewhere within the iPad program. I ask you to fill that back. I am reliably informed that the iPads are alarmed if you don't fill out the feedback forms, they will go off. So I will encourage you not to incur that embarrassment by not filling that back for us. So we discussed on this course this day the regulatory priorities from across the Atlantic, many of which have relevance to UK-based managers regardless of whether they're themselves or SEC authorised. We talked about governance and tone at the top from the SEC and how seriously management need to take compliance. We discussed the areas of conflicts of interest, marketing, custody, valuation, portfolio management as all areas of key interest to the SEC. We discussed prioritising the SEC's prioritisation of never-before-examined firms and reminders that firms should make sure that their broken windows are fixed before the SEC calls. We've considered the impending implementation of AIFMD and what that means for investors and managers, the impact this is having on the newly formed depository market, on service providers, on offshore fund boards, and the effect the AIFMD is having on the FCA as it seeks to manage the many authorisations and to vary permissions that it's processing. We've also considered the AIFMD from the investor's perspective and also considered whether or not firms would consider moving out of the UK to operate, base their AFM operations offshore. We've considered how compliance software can be used as an organisational governance tool to provide structure, transparency and control to firms' compliance arrangements. We've learned alternative ways to identify skill within asset managers and been provided with tips and hints to ensure the taxman does not benefit too much from the application and achievements of those skills. We considered the UK regulatory priorities, important messages we heard. Wholesale firms are definitely on the FCA's radar. Keep up to date with the regulatory agenda. Expect the FCA to focus on fee arrangements, and only stupid people and crooks get enforced against. But to close, I want to return... No, sorry, going on. So this is Cordium Forum, What Lies Ahead, 2004, a compelling year for regulation. Yes, I think there is much that we feel coerced, forced, required to do against our better inclinations. And I think that's the negative connotation of the word. But the FCA is also compelling us to put compliance at the heart of what we do, to make sure the culture is right, and that we do the right things because they are the right things to do for our investors and not because the regulator is telling us to do them. Over the past 3 years, we've held these regulatory forums. Cordium has grown significantly, now established in 5 locations internationally with over 150 staff globally, providing professional services including regulatory software, training, recruitment, accounting, regulatory reporting, taxation, risk management, hosted investment management services and regulatory consulting. We still operate with compliance at our centre, compelled to work with you to ensure that we manage what lies ahead together. I'd like to thank Bloomberg for hosting today's Cordium regulatory event, thank Louise and Barry for organising the event and also arranging all the iPad logistics with concise medium. I'd like to thank all the presenters and the panellists for their valuable contributions throughout the day, and also to the Cordium staff who've helped organise the event. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today, for your contributions via iPad, and I trust that you've found the event informative, insightful and hopefully too compelling. On behalf of all of us at Cordium, I invite you to join us outside for what now lies ahead, drinks and cannabis. Good afternoon.